Good evening, everyone. My name is Ashad Lalji, and welcome to Localizing Design Best Practices, a panel discussion on the processes and challenges to individualize and localize design in the field of architecture, interiors, graphic design, and the culinary arts. We're delighted to partner with the Consulate General of the Kingdom of Netherlands, Masque and El Decor, to bring you this evening. In fact, this discussion works out as the opening session for ID Satellite Mumbai, Design Trails, brought to you by El Decor. And a special thanks to Pramati, wherever she is, for including us in this wonderful partnership, and it's a really cool IP that we've been following for a bit. We at Avid are always looking for new opportunities to push the envelope and introduce our city to something different and a fresher perspective, and this one fits right in. Our ongoing partnership with the Dutch Consulate and the program Holland Meets Mumbai, this is the second of the 3 programs we're doing with them, is also very much about meeting of the 2 cultures, and we're interested to see how Dutch and Indian design and design thinking can find synergies. For those who don't know us, Avid Learning is a public programming platform. We're the cultural arm of the SR Group. We do about 150 programs a year around art, culture and heritage, literature and innovation, and we do through various formats which are pretty engaging, from workshops to talks to master classes to conversations such as this, through partnerships also such as this. And we are driven by the belief that, which is also our hashtag, learning never stops, and we can't wait what we're going to learn today. So before I call upon the Consul General of Netherlands to say a few words, and then Pramati will say a few words, please take out your phones, everyone, put it on silence, and then don't put it away. We want you to get social, tweet, retweet, tag us, post, repost. Our handle is @AvidLearning, and our hashtag is learning never stops. Over to you, Guido, and thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much, Assad. My name is Guido Tielman, Consul General of the Netherlands, and thank you actually for reading out my speech. Assad, all the things that I was supposed to say, you already mentioned. No, it's really a pleasure to be able to contribute to this event. As Assad said, throughout this month we are going to organize a bunch of events, business-related events, but also culture-related events. This, in fact, is the second event that we are organizing in the field of design. And again, I'm really happy to be able to contribute to this event from the Dutch Consul General side. Also because we didn't know this restaurant, and it looks really nice, and actually we already, my wife and myself, made a reservation for Saturday evening. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm really happy that we've been able to fly over Mark de Roo of Linked Design. I know Mark from quite a while ago, and we worked together in China during my previous posting. This is his first foray, if I understand correctly, on the Indian market. So, Mark, this is your opportunity to shine. And I hope that tonight is going to be a very productive panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see a nice houseful lot here to flag off our 3rd design trail for ID Satellite Mumbai. I am the editorial and content director for El Decor magazine that's been in the country more than 17 years now. And we do something called the India Design Show in New Delhi in the February. It's been 5 years now, 6 coming up, and so we said we must do something in Bombay. What better place than this lovely little lane, the Shakti Mills lane, and what better place than this mill, to do something related to design and home decoration. We have been doing the design trail for the last 3 years in the 5 stores that are around in the outside part. This year we had the pleasure of having Masque on board with us as well. And it worked out so beautifully because the theme of the trail this time is art and design and how the two mix together. And when I met with Assad, it just worked out so beautifully that he was also planning this talk, and then we went and met Masque, and it all worked out. And I think what Pratik also creates here is really, really artistic, besides being very yummy as well. So before, I won't say more, but maybe after the talk, if you guys want to just wander around the stores outside, we'll try and give you all little maps, which you can just follow the trail and join the party post the talk. Thank you.
So before our lovely panel begins, I'd like to introduce you to each of them very briefly. Today, our panel comprises of experts from across the design gamut. We have Dutch graphic designer Marc de Roo, head chef at Masque restaurant Pratik Sadhu, and curator and space stylist Sheila Chatterjee, in conversation with architect and designer Rajiv Thakkar.
Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening, and thank you, El Decor, Consul General Netherlands, Masque, and Avid for inviting me here and inviting all the panelists and everyone here this evening. Thank you, Srila, Pratik, and Mark. I think I'm very interested to hear tonight's conversation, and I agreed to do this. Normally, I'm very hesitant about moderating discussions, but I think tonight's discussion is about something that I myself personally am curious about, setting up my own practice and always trying to find what drives that practice or what identity one has within the space of design or a global context or a local context. So I think the general discourse on contemporary architectural practice has also always talked about this idea of localization or globalization. And I think tonight, what I would do first, before I ask each of the panels to talk about their specific work, maybe just to focus a little bit on a kind of foundation for the evening, which I think is one word for me that kind of sums it all up, is this idea of globalization. And that's maybe why we're here tonight, to kind of react to that word or react to processes that have to do with the idea of globalization. So, so the globalization itself, I mean, although the term itself is only about 40, 45 years old, since it's been used in philosophy and otherwise understanding the world, it's probably a process that is thousands of years old. I mean, if you really think about things like very, very simple things like the idea of migration, or you think about the ideas of imperial colonization, trade, and cultural exchange, it's been around for a very long time. But only since maybe the 1970s or mid-1970s, when technology and other systems started to connect the globe in a much, much greater way and more impactful way, has this term globalization actually played a role in defining each one of us and understanding where we are within the world. So if we talk about that a little bit in the beginning, I think it might set an interesting set of questions later on. So globalization is basically talking about the greater sense of networking and interdependence of people around the world. And it really does have to do with this idea of migration. It has to do with the financial systems that have been set up, and interaction between political structures and mechanisms, and also the idea of the great cultural exchange which has happened because of globalization. I think nobody can refute that that has had a great impact on the idea of innovation and productivity in terms of culture. And tonight, I think what we're going to be talking about is really the culinary arts, design, graphic design, architecture, and urbanism, and other things. So if we, but I think the other thing globalization has also done is that in this great big world where there's so many things happening, it can also suggest that there's a kind of singularity that's produced by that, and that talks about homogenization, right? So at the end of the day, we have to address this idea of homogenizing a world, homogenizing a space, homogenizing a city, and all of us kind of interact and engage within that. So maybe that tonight we'll learn a little bit about how to get away from this idea of homogenization and look more back into the local and where we are. So how do we counter homogenization? It's actually a very difficult process because products are maybe the same wherever you go. Somebody in New York is having a similar product to that they're having in Mumbai, and that experience, one can try to map it, but it becomes very difficult. So one way of developing, or one way of thinking about altering this homogenization, is looking at the idea of experience. And experience is becoming a bigger trend in terms of design and the kind of creative fields, where it creates this idea of a design strategy that kind of goes away from your conventional branding, logos, products, materials that define a product, but it's more about how a product or an idea can reach out into individual cultures and make a more kind of impact, maybe on the quality of life of the community that's there, and most likely on other processes and local processes that happen in those cities itself. And that's the second one, is basically this idea of a global strategy where an idea infects or hybridizes a local idea, right? And something new pops out of that. So I think there are two different things that kind of affect this idea of homogenization in our context. And what that leads to is this idea of localization. It's like a hyper localization of, and this is the trend we're seeing nowadays, is that people are not just looking at the visual aesthetic, they're not just looking at how something kind of superficially reacts with the culture, but they're looking at how they can really connect to the people within that culture and make a difference between the people. Because at the end of the day, what's going to make it local is, and I think we were talking about this before, it's not the product, it's not the chair, it's not the website, it's the people that consume that product. And the more we interact with that, those people interact with each other, the more we can get into this idea of hyper localization. The other two things which are important and have some type of effect on this idea of homogenization and globalization are, one would be digitization and technology, which at the end of the day have brought us a great amount of what we know around the world. I mean, much more than anything else, I would say, in the last 30 years. And probably digitization and technology are the first things to come after the Industrial Revolution, which have such a great impact on the world. But due to the increase in these digital platforms and how much we digitally consume, whether we're on our phones or whether we're on the computer or whether we're seeing things that are not real around us, that are somewhat maybe their media interfaces or other things, has that had an impact on what we see as local and what we see as global? I think that's a really big question which we'll talk about here tonight. And the second thing is this perception of what is global, for example, urbanization. At Studio X for many years, the whole focus we were looking at was the idea of cities, right? We were not even talking about anything else. We were just talking about urbanization. So if we talk about Bombay, are we talking about Shanghai? Are we talking about Singapore, New York City? No, we're talking about Bombay. So what makes Bombay, Bombay? And that's a question that I think is increasingly becoming more difficult to ask because there are a lot of different perspectives on what we should want within our cities and within the built environment that we make. So I think the first question I'll ask to each of the participants is really, can you just each talk about your own work in a way, maybe one project or one process that you've gone through, in which localization is a strategy and has played kind of a key role in developing your process?
Hi everyone, my name is Prateek, and I'll just tell you a little bit about what we do at Masque and how we started the entire journey as well. So basically, you know, when we wanted to start this restaurant, and again, I'm using the term local, and I said, you know, I think we're very blessed that, you know, we live in this part of the world where we're very, very, very diverse. Every 100 miles or 100 kilometers, you'll see people who speak differently, people who eat differently, they speak different language, they look different. So, you know, then we started thinking again. I said, so what is local for us? So what we've done is we've taken India as a region to source each and every ingredient of ours. Our chocolates are Indian origin chocolates. They're made in Pondicherry. Saffron is grown in Kashmir. We find morels from, you know, the northernmost part of Kashmir, which are widely grown. And so on and so forth. I mean, we keep finding ingredients all from India, and we coin them as local. And that's what our philosophy has been from day one. Also what we've done, we've taken, obviously we're local in terms of ingredients, we're very seasonal as well. Morels are only grown in, they come out in June and July. So for us, morel season or morel dish would be there in freshly in June and July, and then we dry them and make it more interesting for the rest of the months. So that is what Masque is all about. We celebrate ingredients, we celebrate local ingredients. We try to identify also a lot of those ingredients which people have never seen of and which people just read about it. For example, I'll give you a small example of a berry called sea buckthorn, which is found in Ladakh. So we go every August, we make a trip to Ladakh. We forage sea buckthorn. It's a tiring process. It grows wildly all around the region, and we get it to Masque, and we serve as one of our courses. So yeah, so that's what Masque is in a nutshell.
What about the nature of the process of how you serve the food? For example, it's a 12-course, or a 13-course meal. Like, what is?
So in our 12 course, of course, we have a progression where you go from course 1, which is a very tiny course, just to kind of make you understand our philosophy. So our first course is Inside the Kitchen, where we tell you and kind of explain you what Masque is all about and what we believe in and how are we doing things differently, and also being very local at the same time. And so there are a lot of things in terms of taste and textures that we develop. So there's a lot of R&D which goes behind when you get an ingredient. A small ingredient like lotus stem, I think we did a R&D for a month just to get one dish right. Be it the taste, be it the texture, or if we can boil it. What can we do? What kind of water can we use? I mean, we have gone into details discussing that if we're getting a particular ingredient from Uttarakhand, I think we should get the water also. So maybe the taste will, that becomes really local, that defines that ingredient as local. So yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me here. Indeed, like Guido said before, it's my first time in India. Actually the third day, and it's been wonderful to see the city and explore and find all these new cultures. Regarding your question, localization, as a graphic designer back in 1996, you really tried to make one logo, and with print, it was always, of course, try to create something that was identical for everybody. Nowadays, with branding, you see the shift where no longer the logo is telling the story, but it's more the corporate R&D, basically, the DNA of a company that you want to explore and present. I can give you one example that we used last year, 2 years ago, for a charity program where it was all about getting closer to kids who actually had to work with this project. And we didn't come up with one logo, we came up with a whole scheme of logos that kids would actually try to create themselves again. And technology nowadays helps you, in this case kids, to actually make their own logo online, print it, reproduce it, bring it to a printer. So in the end, this charity doesn't have one logo, it has hundreds of thousands of logos that we didn't even develop ourselves. We just came up with the whole scheme and the idea how they were reacting to the ideas of this charity program, and based on this create their own new type of logo that they would use in their social media. So sometimes looking more into what a customer really needs and what they're trying to achieve, you can actually help them by creating a logo scheme, which is not about one logo, but about local use of a logo.
It's more of a process, like the idea of a kit of parts or something, customization of...
Customization, and it's also about, in this case, it's about selling stamps. It's the Dutch people may know it, kinderpostzegels. It's a program where kids at the age of, let's say, 11, 12, at middle school, they learn to become entrepreneurs by selling stamps door by door. And with the money that they raise, they would actually use this money again for other charity programs. And we thought every kid that is trying to sell something should have his own story, why he's selling that. So we should create a logo that he can use in his own social media, in his own print, that is telling his story. So instead of making one logo, we came with a whole scheme. And it was very nice to see that, I think a month, 2 months later, at Facebook we found out there was hundreds of logos floating around that we've never even designed. And yet, just by using the same bricks that we developed, it was recognizable. And that's how localization can actually work.
It's amazing, actually, if you think about that on scale. So you're talking about graphic design. Architects or urbanists, they might make a component that gets put out into a system, and then that component is reused in many different ways, and you see it all over the city, right? So it happens at different scales through different disciplines, and also really...
I've seen it the last couple of days already here, how products are being reused. The cradle to cradle here is basically around the corner. combine that with technology like 3D printing, and all of a sudden you can actually create your own new house, you can create your own bridge, you can create your new buildings, basically. Yeah.
Shala?
So one of the things I grew up ingrained with was that there was a time and a place for everything, and I feel very strongly about globalization in that context. There is a time and a place for it, and it isn't everything. And so when I decided that it was the time for me to do something I really wanted to, because I'd been 25 years in film, in advertising, which I had enjoyed a lot of, didn't like the last bit of. I was very strongly influenced by the fact that I wanted to do something I really believed in. So I wanted to do it not because it was the trend or because of the way other people did it, but because of what I believed should be the way it was done. And so when I set up with my partner a store called Barrow, which is now a year old and is a furniture and home store, it strove to just be what we believed in. So for me, the defining thing of localization is honesty. And if you're honest about what you're doing, it's local, because you're not looking for it anywhere except within yourself and what you believe in. So even if what you believe in is miles away, it's because you want it, not because somebody else told you about it. So at Barrow, what we do is we very naturally just, everything is local in some way or the other. I mean, we use only reclaimed teak, and one day it's going to not be available anymore, but at the moment it is, so we use it. And if you don't like the fact that it has markings and knots and all kinds of things, you can't use our furniture, because we're not going to do it in something else. And we only polish by hand, and we use things that aren't harmful, because I really think that's the point of using wood. Why would you put something else on it if you had great wood, right? And I don't design the furniture, Siddharth, my partner, does, but I work a lot in how it becomes, and I think what it must become is what you, the customer, wants. It mustn't be what I want or what somebody in some magazine is telling you about. It should be about what you saw, read about, but eventually want to localize into you. So there are options. You choose your options of fabric, of color, and things like that. And that's what I think is really the core of what being local means. And in a more literal way, the art that we champion is stuff I'm really passionate about. It's a lot of tribal and folk art, which until a few years ago was just stuff you got at the cottage industries or at very old museums or havelis. And today you can walk into a Barrow, and I'm so excited about the fact that the people who do, and so many who do, are really interested and excited about the just traditional art that no longer is traditional. It's cool because it's the context you put it in. So if it stops being in something that looks like a dowdy museum and is actually just a cool place where anything could be, it starts becoming a really cool piece of art. And I think that really is the challenge, to find how not following a trend or not doing what is the easy way, but sometimes can be harder and longer, and local is cool. So that's something that we've been doing, not just in art and in furniture, but in even the things we do. We use our space for a lot of what should I say, curating lots of art experiences. And for me, what was very important was to remember that there are people, no matter how small they might be, there are people who don't need you to dumb down. We don't have to make everything for the lowest common denominator. And if somebody doesn't understand something always, that's fine. They'll find out or they'll move on. The idea is not to exclude people, but the idea is to let them open their minds and not just do something that's available everywhere else. And it's fantastic because people respond fantastically. And I think my belief, or my fundamental understanding of this whole question of local versus global, is you can't just say I want to do something local or there's a problem with global. I mean, there's a huge shift in your head. You have to have an epiphany like I did, where it isn't all about the investment banker way of life. It doesn't really matter whether you're going to have 25 shops in the next 6 months and what the turnover is going to be. What you want to do is find out what your life needs. And if you can get to that without being greedy, I think it makes life workable at all levels for everybody. But that's a big change. It's not fashionable, but I'm delighted to experience that there's a lot more people who think like that, and that's what actually changes things.
What is it about the Indian context? Like, for example, if you say specifically, like if you had the store somewhere else in some other country, but you can't say necessarily, but what is it about the Indian context that's just so special, which might lend to this idea of the processes that are behind the store and your...
Well, what's certainly special about India is I think there is no other context or no other example of a one geographical place that gives you such a range of anything, range of visual, culture, design, art, people, everything. So that can be a disadvantage, but if you look at it the other way and the advantage and how much you can draw from it and how much you can pull from it, that in itself is an experience like no other. I mean, there really is nothing else that can give you the wealth of the influence in everything beautiful. And just the discovery of that away from what most people know about into things that haven't even been tapped yet is incredible.
Correct. I will also chime in, since even though I'm moderating, it's nice to hear about architecture and urbanism a little bit. We read about it in the papers every day. And well, you know, if I talk about this idea of adapting locally, you know, sometimes it's just a term that's created which is the same term that's reinvented 20 or 30 years later or 50 years later. And this is, I mean, this is just what I see all the time. This idea of localization is a term that architects use and urbanists use to talk about this idea of critical regionalism, right? Critical regionalism is actually the same thing as talking about localization, in which critical regionalism was defined as a way to, in a way, refute international modernism. So localized places all over the world started to look at their local architecture, their local spaces, their local materials, their local craft, and start to design without designing kind of cookie cutter blocks and modern buildings on pilotis with the landscape going below and people in high-rise blocks. So this term has been used for the last 50, 60 years since modernism came about. And it was also a reaction to postmodernism. So postmodernism reacted negatively to modernism by ornamenting things kind of just randomly all over the world. And critical regionalism now is back in favor with architects that want to connect back to the places where they make their buildings or their spaces. So that's kind of my perspective on that. And in my work itself, I would say that I don't have a particular style. Like, I can't say I'm a modernist, although when I went to school, I was trained in modernism. The only architects that we really studied were Louis Kahn, Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier. This is what we learned. These were the three people that we kind of looked up to at that stage. And of course, there were all the other people around it, but those were the three. And when I came to, when I traveled to Florence and I did my one-year program while I was at Syracuse University, we did a one-year program at Florence. That was the first time I was actually outside of the United States learning about architecture in a place that was so rich, like Europe, and traveled all over Europe. When I went back to the US, I looked at things totally differently. And I practiced there for many years. Then when I came there and I came here to India, I mean, my perspective has totally changed. I have 3 brothers who live in the US. They'll never want to come to India. I'm the only person out of my family has gone from parents emigrating to the US and then one person coming back and living here, and now my children want to go back to the US. When they grow up, they're only 4 years old and they say, I'm American, I want to go back. So it's a very interesting exchange that keeps on happening every 20, 30 years, and we keep on redefining all these things. So, yes?
Isn't that also something that's always happening? When you're younger, you want to move away, and once you're away, you want to go back to where you once were born? Isn't that maybe the same thing that we have with our own culture? At one time, when internationalization started, we all thought that something else was better. And after a couple of years, we started to realize that what we had wasn't so bad, and that we actually liked the old things that we are, at one point, maybe we thought weren't so special, but now that we've seen the rest of the world, we start to realize that we did have some very unique elements. And then we want to go back to our own traditional elements and integrate that into design. And technology, again, makes that possible. I think, while you were talking, I was thinking, localization is happening around us all the time. I think if we use Google and I would search something here, I would get completely different results than when I would use Google at home, because it's localized. I get the local results. But I think if we all get out our phones, and we're not allowed to do so, but, and we would all have the same search request, we would still get all different results, because they would even take in consideration what we searched before, what our personal requests are. So technology makes it possible that everybody gets his own unique result. And isn't that also then personalization and localization? Because it's not just local, it's also personal. So the way I perceive if I walk around this area is completely different than anybody else. So it's my opinion if I walk around this area, what I believe. And we all may like it. We like it in different elements, and we all like different styles about it. So it's not just localization, but it's also personal opinion about what you believe is so unique. That's why you maybe move back to India and your kids say, I want to go back to. So it's your personal, and if you can grab that into something that you make, into your art, all of a sudden, your architecture is also your architecture and your vision on how you see the world.
Absolutely, there's a cross-pollination that's happening constantly, you know, with people going all over the place. Since you brought up the question of digitization and technology, I think that's a good question to ask the panel. How does that affect this idea of localization? Because I think I talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but I didn't explain that, you know, sometimes I get so caught up with my phone, or I get so caught up with being on the computer all day, that there's a point where I just want the power to go. I don't want any signal to be there. I don't want anything there. And that's because the experiences that I have in that platform, in that media interface, are so difficult. So I think here we have an interesting group that deal with a mix. You're dealing with a very real experience, Pratik. Mark, you're dealing with real experiences that eventually happen, but you're also dealing with that media interface. That's a big part of the kind of work that you do. And Shrila's talking about slow life, and slow living, and slow making, and making a space that is not about kind of producing massive quantities of things, but producing the right experience and that right kind of connection. So if we can talk about this as...
Yeah, in my field, it's really about the different touch points that you have. So if it's offline, if it is event communication, if it's online, if it's print, you should always have the same experience from the brand point of view. Even though you use different, you use your hands or you use your eyes or you hear it, it should still all have the same feeling. So that is, and that's tricky. That's really difficult to actually to create that. But technology, like you said, is making it more available. Social media, I'm not sure how social it is every now and then, because you do of course see that people always look at the phone, even though I think you would definitely agree they should actually go offline and talk to each other. But then again, that's the new reality for everybody born after 2000. I think that's their world. Their world is actually in a device. And for them, it's completely localized again.
Well, of course, I have a very different perspective for this, because I feel technology helps us being more local. I mean, I'm just talking purely of being a chef. Because today, if I want a particular berry, I mean, I can just give you a berry on the plate and you can eat it. But what is that experience that you're getting out of it? If I'm telling you that, you know, obviously I have a big story about, you know, how this berry was foraged. And I'll again go back to the example of Seabukthon. You know, you go to Ladakh, and then from Ladakh you travel to the border of Pakistan, get those berries, and then, you know, now the way we present, now this is where the technology helps us. So we can, today we have dehydrators, today we have machines which help us. So for example, we have a rotatory mixer which helps us to just get the aroma, distill the juices of Seabukthon, get the aroma, and we can present the guest, you know, in many different forms. So we're still being local, but at the same time, that technology has really helped us, you know, creating that kind of experience for our guests. And I again believe that, you know, it's for us, it's helping us being very local. You know, we have dehydrators today. We can do textures. We can do different kind of, not taste, but of course textures, the kind of way we present things. So definitely technology has really helped the culinary world in making it a far better place.
What I take from what Prateek has said is that technology is an aid, and I don't for a minute think that there isn't incredible stuff that's happened in the world because of technology. I just think that we're kind of missing the wood for the trees. It is only an aid, and I believe very strongly in that only, and nothing ever substitutes for your own imagination and for things that you can do that will never come out of a manual, but will come out of you thinking differently. And so in reply to a question of how you're dealing with technology and also being local, I think in today's environment, you don't have to think of ways in how to use technology. You have to think on ways in how to not use it and do something different. So using it is, of course, you use it all the time, but not using it and adding value or doing something different, I think that's the quest, and that's where you forge a path that's different or that has a character that somebody can recognize.
I think also what I was maybe also suggesting was that the fact that we are so kind of media and digitally oriented even in our personal lives and at work, that there's a kind of sense of longing which affects then our physical environments. Like, for example, what do you want to do in your off time when you're not in that interface? Or how do you want to make an experience in the evening? For example, if 12 courses or 13 courses, that's your whole evening. It's not about club hopping and doing all this kind of stuff. That's the experience. And maybe going into the kitchen is what I long for. So I think it's just more about how a digital space or how being in one type of space, which is kind of floating around all over the world, and how you kind of ground yourself in the context where you are, like your city or your local community. I mean, I think that's an interesting effect. And if you look at films, for example, you look at any of the films I've made in the last 5-6 years, a lot of them are talking about a sci-fi-ness, about there being some artificial intelligence controlling everything, and the spaces that you're in are really guided by your technology. Those are all just telltale calling signs of what there is going to happen in the future. So, and there's always this space, which is the real space. I mean, I just saw that movie recently, Blade Runner 2049, right? So everything is so digital and controlled, and there's your artificial wife and girlfriend and this and that. Sorry. Okay, but there's always a space which is the most interesting, which is the space you go outside of that, which is the real space of that movie or that film, and that's always the kind of kick point, So I think that's something we can, if you guys want to comment on, or you want to move on to the next.
I think there's also an exaggeration of how much all people live in the digital world. In my experience and what I do, I'm not dealing with very young people. And as important as I'm constantly told our social media is for just the business I do, just for the store and what we're selling, I know that the vast majority of our clients and the people who are buying our stuff aren't looking either on Facebook or Instagram for it. They're coming to touch it and feel it and talk about it. And they use Facebook and Instagram for fun. So if I was selling Nike shoes, I would probably need to live on Instagram or in Messi's pocket. But when you're selling something that is handmade and hand polished or whatever, so you choose where you need it. I do think it's really, really exaggerated, but I don't think everybody agrees with me.
It's not about belief. It's not about belief, it's actually what's happening, I believe, in the world at the moment. That the kids, we had a project, and I saw it earlier today, what is the symbol of panic? So kids at the age of 14 asked them to draw up a symbol of panic. The symbol of panic for them, no, it's a battery that's almost dead. That's the panic button. That's the only thing, that's absolute panic. What can you do if there's no more battery in your iPhone? Well, this is their real life.
Sad. It's very sad.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's sad. It's like you said, it's reality.
That's okay. That's another. That's Avid's next talk. We're gonna do that. Okay, are we losing our identity in this whole idea of this glocal? Because there's the global, right, and then there's a local, and now there's something called the glocal, right, which is, right, okay, so, but what has that glocal actually done? I mean, I think it's something we can address tonight. Is it a localization, or is it just the kind of interface that has been able to kind of adapt locally and change? For example, like you might say, a fast food chain kind of locally opening up. It's an international fast food chain. I don't want to name names, but they provide a product which is tasty in the local context, for example, right? So is that localization or is that globalization?
That's a good question. I know that without naming, but it's a big M. They have completely different recipe here than they have in China or that they have in Europe. The sizes are different. The taste is different. So they localize. But when is localization localization? Do you have to know it's locally owned? Do you have to know this is locally made? Or do you just feel that this feels really natural to you?
But, okay, just to counter that, or just to think about it, the process of getting that product is the same. Let's say if I go...
No, not even, no.
No?
Kentucky Fried Chicken in China is actually completely different than it is in America, where it's all about shared dining. So even though a fast food chain in America is...
So that is like...
No, I'm sure recipes are the same. Recipes are the same. They're the same recipes.
No, it's not like your restaurant for sure. But for example...
No, I'm talking about KFC in perspective. I'm sure they have a same recipe, but the chickens are different.
Yeah, and they actually leave the bones inside, for example.
Yeah.
Which they don't do in other countries. So they actually leave the bones inside because people like to use and chew on all the bones. So they're actually changing it. The thing is, they don't actually communicate it always. That is something which I wonder if localization, do you have to say this is locally produced? Is it then better? Or does it have to feel that it's locally, I just feel that this is something that is close to my heart?
Right, I would say like shared dining, for example, as an idea, if it was really pushed as an idea and that's what's happening locally, for example, in a community or a city in China, that might be an interesting way to think about localization. Less about the product and the branding because that more or less stays the same, right? But, you know, apparently also just talking about KFC, since we didn't bring up the M one, I think in Borivali or somewhere north, closer to Thane, there is a KFC that does not serve chicken. Yes, I was told this a month ago.
I don't think so.
No, there is. This is what they said.
So
they don't serve chicken.
It's KFP, Kentucky Fried Potatoes.
Something like that. Something like that. I'm waiting.
It's like a beer without alcohol.
I will find out. I will find out, and we will all go there.
No, but you know, I'm just answering this question of being local or localization is. I'll talk about ingredients primarily because. A lot of things like now people are saying, you know, we grow asparagus in India, but the question is, was it indigenous to India or no? Again, I mean, this can open a Pandora box, of course, because potatoes are not from India or tomatoes, like they're or from Peruvian region. Italians say we grew tomatoes, but it's actually from Peru. But I again feel that the kind of ingredients that we were grown in India, I think 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, we don't see them now. There used to be a different potato variety. Of course, now there are heirloom variety of tomatoes and potatoes or rather carrots. Now people have started doing it. But again, it's a question like, is it really local for us? I don't know. Again.
So I think what Pratik's brought up is, is for me the interesting part of this whole debate of global, local, whatever. Because is it really important to split hairs between where it came from or what it's like somewhere else? To me, what's really important about local is the community. Does it involve the community? Is it of the community? How far does it involve and impact the community? That is the only real meaning of local as far as I'm concerned. So whether it's asparagus that's being grown somewhere that has never heard of asparagus, but suddenly you have a whole community that is involved in it and is flourishing from it and is learning from it, or it's some kind of design that nobody ever thought of before and has come from miles away in Amsterdam maybe, but is impacting the people in a small part of India or in a big part of India and is changing the local thought and what they're doing. To me, that's what local is. That it's far beyond just the bottom line of a company that is doing well in a small circle, but is influencing and impacting and changing for the good in anything that a whole community feels they're part of. Then it becomes local.
Yeah, I totally agree that it's also more about local economy. That's I think what you also mean. Is it still normal that you would ship something halfway across the world just because you want to have an ingredient? Is it normal that we would have something in the middle of the winter even though it's not in season? So thinking about creating products actually in season are created locally and produced is more about sustainable as well, I believe, in your case.
Oh yeah, it's more about sustainability, yeah.
Okay, next question, sustainability, it's kind of gone naturally into that. What does sustainability have to do with this whole thing? I mean, I think that is actually key, because I was just listening to Pradeep talk about this idea of ingredients, and I was thinking it's so interesting to see, a restaurant which is very contemporary, very kind of chic, and in the midst of this very urban environment, and you have this whole idea of the kind of farm to fork, the what's around you, just being assembled and designed in a way to give you a great experience. So that. Two of those things don't necessarily always go together, So I think that's something we can talk about in terms of the sustainability, the idea of how these spaces
No, it's
work.
great. I believe it's great to be local, but at the same time, it's very important and it's very imperative to be sustainable as well. I mean, we can, I'll take an example of a fish. For example, a lot of people are using kingfish, and there was a news that kingfish will. In next 15, 20 or 30 years, you won't find any kind of kingfish. So it becomes our responsibility as chefs or as people who are using it, or fishermen, whosoever, obviously it's a big livelihood thing as well for a lot of people, that how sustainable is it? How are we saving it for generation? How are we keeping it alive for like 100 or 200 or 1,000 years? So for me, it's very important to be sustainable in the times that we live in. Because we need to cater and we're very much responsible for the future generations as well. So being sustainable.
So that ethical kind of choice comes into
it's
how...
It's a very ethical choice that we need to make today. Being sustainable.
Yeah, and regulation could help there. To give a nice example of Austria, in the Austrian Alps, they have these beautiful mountain little restaurants in the Alps, and by law in Tyrol, all the products that you serve have to be within a 50-kilometer radius, otherwise you can't use it. So automatically all the chefs have to work with the local products from the Tyrol region. And I think it has to do with prideness as well. I think that's a very important thing. You can only be local and use your local products if you have a certain education about the products, about your history, but also a certain proudness about the fact that you actually truly believe in the quality of the products. So regulation could be beneficial to create this local economy.
I think the key to sustainability really is a belief in the fact that the world is not about you only. And if you have a conscience and that leads to ethical thinking, to sharing, to being aware of a community and around you, I think everything just falls into place, including pressure to change any kind of law or influence people who actually are in power. But too little in, it doesn't matter what happens anywhere else. Too little in our community is about the community. It's about I, me, and myself. And you'll find wherever things are changing or flourishing, it's because somebody leads the notion that, it's about more than that, and it's about, let's think of a bigger picture, and that becomes a sustainable issue that then becomes the norm. And that really is what I guess we're all aiming for.
Okay, so I'll also maybe give an example. if we look at our cities, or if we look at architecture within our cities, if we talk about this idea of localization, I mean, one, it's maybe difficult to kind of put on par to par, but let's say I decide to make a series of buildings in Bombay and I kind of replicate something in New York or Shanghai. I make a skyscraper, or I make little apartment units stacked 60, 70 stories up. And for that, I need to get a plot of land, or I need to take that land and people are living on that on G+1 or G+2 structures. And then I have to make something that is 70 stories and move people out of that community to somewhere else. That's extremely unsustainable. Like, I'm just talking about not in terms of material, in terms of energy and resources, but in terms of culturally, right? You're basically moving people maybe out of their neighborhoods, out of where they get their livelihoods, out of where they were born, where they kind of lived for 20, 30, 50 years, and moving them to other places where they have to kind of start afresh or change, right? So these are kind of ways in which sustainability and also localization, like where I think lots of research is being done by architects and by academicians on how to make, for example, housing for the Indian market. Really what you look at is housing, what we're selling is really not housing for the Indian market, we're just selling luxury mid-level housing, right? But we're not making housing for the people, which are the local, and that's not just people in the slum or the settlement, that's also people like me, who is a local right now, although I'm from somewhere else. And I don't want to live on the 60th floor. I want to live in maybe what my memories of a child living in the suburbs of New Jersey or Long Island were like. You know, I want to also live like that, or I want to live in a little more dense community, a mid-dense community with people that go outside, that kind of come to common spaces, that can go to public parks. So there are many ways in which we can think of localization and this idea of sustainability, from the food itself to the buildings and the environment around us, to the furniture and things that we make things out of and recycle, and then the, of course, the kind of media interfaces and products we make around the world. So,
Just a question to you. Would measurements be completely different for different parts of the world? The measurements of room size, of height?
Yes, of course. It is very different. And because it's all dependent on the market also, it's not just about how we kind of use spaces. Of course, I think locally we're very used to having and living in tighter spaces. If we think about how culturally we've kind of grown up, extended families and people grown up this way, where I used to live in a house where a two-bedroom flat where there were 9, 10 people living in the living room, in the bedroom, in all those spaces, but also because of the property prices, right? So the property prices are so high that you can't afford to get a bigger space. You have to learn to live within that kind of constraint. So that is, you know, it's all tied into many things, and like I said in the beginning, financial systems are a part of what generates this idea of something that reacts with this localization. So. Okay, so the next one I think what should be interesting is international experiences. Like, I think those are kind of things that either grow on us in a way or they kind of change us in a way. And how do those affect the local kind of processes which we engage in? So, Pratik, I know you were educated also abroad. And so maybe you can start the conversation. How did that affect the work that you're doing here today?
I mean, I was very young, and of course I do miss bar hopping when you mentioned it before. Of course I studied in New York, I started working in New York, I moved a lot of places to West and East Coast. But I think the major turn came when I went to Noma, and I suddenly realized that you know, the kind of stuff they were doing, taking the region into consideration and cooking from the region, using ingredients just from those regions, and also implementing a very sustainable model of, you know, how to use a seafood, or when to use that, or is it good seafood, or is it a sustainable seafood or a sea animal, and what are the things that are just growing in and around us, the kind of mushrooms, the kind of greens that are growing. You know, after working for 3-4 months, that was my last phase, and I moved back to New York, and it kept going on in my head. You know, I think as I said it before, like in India, we're really blessed to have so many different seasons, and from those seasons, the micro seasons come into the picture. And you know, so when I moved back, and it was still in my head, how can I really take India as a region to source everything and get Indian ingredients on the map. Because India was always known abroad, India is always known about about the food, but primarily there are only few, for example, it's more towards butter chicken or like a lot of things, but people don't know about what people eat in Northeast or what people eat in Kashmir. That's not Indian food for them. And when I used to cook like a very different kind of stuff for them, that was not Indian food. So when I came back, that was the realization that, you know, I need to now start promoting the idea of Indian ingredients rather than idea of an Indian food. So exactly, seabuckthorn was one of the biggest finds that we had, rowan berries. And so mulberries are grown extensively in North, like people really don't know about it. There's so many other things. So that's what we're trying to do. That's what I'm also trying to do, to get those Indian ingredients on the map. And the kind of new India cuisine, we call it a Nouvelle India cuisine now. You know, it's a new India cuisine. It's not about, you know, curries or spices. India is more about its ingredients or about that culture or about that old cooking techniques. And in Kashmir, I still remember we eat dried fish with, you know, seagrass. So when I say seagrass, it's the river grass. So you dehydrate the river grass, rehydrate it, and then put in dried fish and eat it. I mean, if you just explain this dish or explain an idea to any other person, I mean, it's not an Indian food, but it is an Indian food. So these are the ideas that, you know, we're trying to promote. These are the ideas which, you know, we're trying to do here at Masque, but in a very progressive way, of course. Yeah.
I get hungry just by listening to you. Can you please stop? If you look at your question, for me, it's the most difficult thing is to be open-minded. I was 16 when I moved as an intern as an exchange student from the northern part of Holland, which is a small village, a few thousand inhabitants, to New York City, which was just by coincidence. And since then, I've traveled around the world, and even yesterday and today, people ask me, so what do you think of India? Is it what you were expecting? And trying to go into a new location without any expectation and just observe it and just feel what's happening and then judge afterwards, not even judging, but make your own opinion. That is for me the life lesson with everything, with design, with new tastes, with new products, with new visions of how to use technology. Don't judge it before, but always experience it first, and then based on this, try to see how you can get the best benefit of that and how to use it in your own local and in your own products and in your own design.
Yeah. No, it's okay.
So I should have continued, sorry.
Did you want to say something on this? International?
Yeah, I think I never lived or studied outside of India, but international influences, like any influences, are things that come in many ways. Travel, reading, meeting people, and every influence is something that I think changes your head and what you believe in some way or the other, and it's critically important because it's the way you go into really understanding your local. You put it in a context. And whenever I've been asked about how do you, my idea of design and how you learn or how it changes, I think the greatest teachers are just travel, of keeping your mind, your eyes, all your senses open to any influence, and wherever they are. I mean, his question was international, but I mean beyond just international, into anything beyond your own little circle. Everything influences you, and the more you take in, the more you change your context.
So for me, I think, you know, besides great education and all that, that's besides the point. But I think working abroad and being abroad in New York for many years and living there, it gave me a great discipline and a focus to be able to kind of want to do something different. And I think from being around me, I just felt like I wanted the opposite. Now I can't imagine going back, you know, and people ask me all the time, they ask me, what are you doing here? Why did you come here? You know, they asked me that, and I said, well, this is the place. I mean, yes, you get frustrated and you do all this, but I think it's just being somewhere else and, like you're saying, seeing the other side and saying, okay, that's where I want to go to, and now this is where I am. For some reason, I can't kind of step back to that. And I think that's really kind of a life lesson that I've learned. If I can bring all of that back into the context that I'm in and add something to this idea of what the local is becoming, that's really, I think, the important thing. Do you ever find similarities, any of you, between certain cultures? Like, can you give me an example of something maybe you found in, you know, somewhere where you've traveled, or maybe with, whether it's with food or the media or producing something that is interesting, kind of commonality?
I think I would really relate the diversity and the Indian culture to a lot of, to Italy actually. Traveling from North to South Italy, it's kind of traveling from Kashmir to at least to Bombay. Because the cuisine changes, dialect changes, not the language, but the dialect definitely changes. People from North, they don't like people from South. I'm not saying like this is the case in India, I'm just... Yeah, people are really like, they're very proud of their regions. A North Italian will be like, you know, I'm from North. And speaking, if a guy is from Sicily, he would never say he's Italian. He'd say, I'm Sicilian, I'm not Italian. So they're very proud of their heritage, they're very proud of their food, and they're very proud of where they come from. So I think a lot of things I could relate to India as well, because a lot of people, of course, like, you know, people from Punjab are really proud of their food, they're very proud of their, you know, heritage and everything. So I think Italy would be the place which I would really...
That's something that says something about the nation and also the kind of independence of people and regions within a nation, you know. I think whether India is actually a series of states of a nation, or you can also consider it's just it's a different country. Like every time you go to a different place, you feel like you're in a totally different place, which is really interesting.
And you know, I also feel that it's, you know, our roots really define us in a way. You know, it's the personality, you know, they really define our personality at the end of the day as well. Somehow it just comes out.
Yeah, I'm constantly accused of giving Baro an extremely Calcutta and Bengali bias, which is true and which is pointed, because in fact even when we started the store and we were looking for names, and our address is 12 Sun Mill, and my partner had all kinds of names, and we agreed that we wouldn't have a name that we would eliminate anything that anybody hated. But as long as it was okay, we'd agree on it. And he had all kinds of suggestions, and one of them was really strange, and I couldn't understand what it was. It was written as B-A-R-H-A or something like that. And I said, what is that? And he said, Bara, as in 12. So I said, no way. And he said, why? So I said, there is no way I'm going to have a Hindi name. So he said, why? I said, because I am absolutely anti the Hindi belt. And I'm never going to have a Hindi name. This country is just dominated by Hindi. So he said, okay, let's do it in Bengali. I said, done, it's Baro. So, I mean, it was, you know, it's just I mean, to carry on your context of similarities, everywhere you go in the world, you will find a similarity. I mean, the world is not inventing itself uniquely for a place. It's similarity of headspace, whether you look at the Aboriginal art in Australia with the Gond art from Madhya Pradesh, and you see the same dotted kind of context, or food that comes from something that might be in Scotland and you'd find similar to something that's in Cody. There are similarities everywhere, because I don't think there's been enough inventions in the world that are unique. And people have moved across huge expanses of land and culture, and the first really famous globalizer was Alexander. I mean, that's thousands of years ago. So, you know, there's a little bit of Greek something in the north of the Indus. There's a little bit of, you know, so all of that. I mean, you'll find bits that you recognize or similarities anywhere you go. I was in Uzbekistan 2 months ago, and I couldn't get over very obvious similarities. I mean, I mean, Babur came from that region, and so many of the waves of people who came into India came from there. So in the architecture and stuff, so many similarities, but also so many similarities in the way of living, and so many dissimilarities. I mean, an Islamic nation that was so secular versus an Indian nation that has secular in its constitution, and I truly question how secular. So things like that, I mean, you'll find everywhere. It's not specific to one place or one culture.
Okay, thank you. I think we can open it up to the... Can we open it up to the audience, and does anybody have any questions for any of the...
Hi, this is Vivek. So the question actually is to all three of you. When we're talking about globalization and localization, the whole challenge of a universality of design in this whole context. That, for example, if somebody walks into your restaurant, we have regions today where locals are moving out, or you have a lot of migrants who are coming in. Restaurants, people coming in who may be from different backgrounds, but the taste would appeal to all of them, irrespective of where they come from. Or your logos, which is something which any organization would have a logo which you would want it to appeal to anyone and everyone who would see it, whichever part of the globe. So how is the challenge of the universality of design to appeal to diversity and the globalization? How does that work?
Well, that's interesting. We work for one client of us, it's ICBC Bank in Beijing, and we help them with the local adaptation of the branding specifically for the European Union, Amsterdam, Belgium, Luxembourg. If you look at the manual that they set up in Beijing, everything in China that goes up is red. Everything that goes down is green. So if you go to the stock exchange in Shanghai, you would see everything of the screens are red. Everybody is happy. In Europe, that's the other way around. Nobody's happy if it's all red. But they dictated this in the manual. So if it goes up, it's green, or red, and it's good. So when we made the annual report for the Netherlands, we said we put everything in black because we want to have black figures. That's normal in the European Union. If everything is good, you have it black. If it's red, that means it goes down. And I had a debate for about half an hour. With somebody that said, no, that should be red, it's dictated, etc., etc. So I gave the explanation. I actually had to show imagery of the stock exchange, how that was completely different. They had no idea of this simple thing that is different. And what we tried to do in photography and there was no typography because it was all in Chinese. So how are we going to use typography for the Western world? So we had to actually reinvent a whole lot of items that still felt like it's ICBC Bank, so it still feels Chinese, yet it's locally adapted. And once we did that for Amsterdam, then the rest of the country started to copy this because they realized it was more locally adapting. And then the question for me really is, why do we do this? We do this to inform the local people about the qualities and what products the ICBC Bank can offer. And to do that, you have to make it so the local community can digest the information most easily. And that is if you use the local culture. There's a lady in the back with the question.
Yeah, Ranjit, my question is to Mr. Thakkar as an architect. I mean, with food and other things, you can always mix things around and yet make them look local. But why is architecture such a disaster in this place? Because you find cement, concrete, and glass being used, but all look so similar and doesn't belong to this place at all. And how could this problem be really addressed?
So, it's I'll talk about it from a different angle. For example, as a person who lives in a city like Bombay, all of what you see around you, and a lot of these advertisements and everything we see, even the movies, Bollywood movies and all, are all about this idea of where we want to go, right? This idea of aspiration, right? And it's never the place that we are, what's around us. It's always something else that we're looking at. And architecture is unfortunately become that, you know. In a city like Bombay especially, forget about, we can talk about other cities and towns which are probably have a better or more local architecture, more regionally critical architecture being produced. Bombay is really not about the physical environment in that way. Bombay is about a physical environment as a commodity, as an aspiration. So that's why we're getting, unfortunately, you know, buildings which are out of context, which don't have anything to do with the way we live. Like today I saw the one that I saw was a woman painting on a big balcony. Like the balcony was maybe, you know, half the size of this room, and she was just sitting there painting, and there was a picturesque landscape in the back of an image. This is an ad for housing development in Goregaon or something like that, you know. It doesn't exist. It's just a figment. So what we want is, we want that to feel like that's what we want, and that's what we're going to get from that, and that's what they're selling. And then eventually what you get is, you know, this. I mean, you might get space, and you might get a flat, and you might get value. Yes, that is all there. But the reality of what it is, and what you're talking about, what's real and what's all this.
I think it's questioning the aspiration. What is that what your aspiration is? Yeah. Unfortunately, it is. And that's the answer to that is not just, and you know, it's not what the builder's doing, it's what's wrong with the individual. Why is that your aspiration?
Hi, I'm Pushpa. My question is to Mark and Ms. Chatterjee. You see, taking design to a broader aspect, doing corporate logos, doing furniture, food, yes. But taking it to a larger, broader landscape, if I call myself a designer, if I take it to a larger landscape, inevitably what is discussed in policy and what is happening in implementation is a huge difference. For example, and in fact, disruption is the norm, which designers don't take into account. Why? For example, locally if you take the cows are being disrupted, hawkers are being disrupted, whereas that is not the intent of the Supreme Court, which has said that you have to give the space to the people. Taking it to a larger context globally, that's locally. Taking it to the global level, on the global level you have one football-sized forest being deforested every minute, right now, right here, in the whole world. Why are designers not looking at waking people up, doing something about it, stopping it when there are alternates available? Why are we continuing in this massive, destructive fashion? What are the designers doing on the larger landscape? Doing serious work. This is all money, which is printed paper. Ultimately, it is printed paper. It is not going to give you your wood. You can do wood foresting, but if you are going to destroy forests football size per minute in the whole world globally, and locally if you're going to disrupt hawkers, lifestyle, cows, everything, what are the designers doing?
That's, I really like your comment, because I couldn't agree more. I think there's a big difference between advertising and design, first of all. I gave a lecture this afternoon, which is the complete difference. I don't really believe in advertising. I don't believe in globalization of brands. I believe that designers using design thinking philosophy can really make a big difference. Where you don't, it's not about the big money. It's not about the money that you want to create with the brand. It's about how you can make sure that every touch point of your brand is in line. And actually, the presentation I gave this afternoon was all about this. If you, for example, want to be environmentalistic, that's one of your core values of a brand, let's say your corporate DNA, then you have to be environmental. Then you have to drive an electric car. You cannot have this image at the outside, kind of, this is who we think we are, yet run a complete different business. And the only companies nowadays who are actually successful incorporate all of this design thinking in all of the elements. Design-driven companies, by the DMI, this is the Design Management Institute, are 221% more successful than the average S&P 500 companies. These are companies like you say, actually try to incorporate all of these elements and be truly about what they say. And I believe designers are the consultants of the future. We should be there right in the beginning to discuss what is the business model? How are you going to be sustainable? Are you really going to be sustainable? That's what we try to do. I started a new organization last year which is called Innovation Crew. Innovation Crew is not just design. It is designers, it is trend analysis, it is finance, it's economics, it's all of that combined into one group of people that will help you create a business plan. Where maybe what you're referring to, in the old days you have a business model and in the end designers just make it look pretty to the outside world so more people buy it. To me that's the old advertising agency model. And it's not something at least I represent. I represent design thinking as the new standard to the future. Realize that I think 70% of the jobs that will be there in 2025, we don't even exist today. We don't know what they will be if you talk about disruption. So how as design thinkers can we actually not work with this, but actually be part of it? And not just make things look pretty, but use our brain to go from linear thinking, one step after the other, into social thinking. How can we make different connections? I think designers, creative people, have the unique ability to combine all different aspects. And we're not being heard of enough in the big boardrooms, who are more into economics and are more into Excel sheets and revenue share. So I think we agree. But just give us the platform. And we all designers, I think all of us here want to actually be part of that.
Could comment also quickly on that. So recently, I mean, I'm an architect, right? And I'm an artist and all that stuff. But recently we, as part of Studio X, we started this film, a documentary film, which we finished about 7-8 months ago. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to understand exactly what you're talking about. Like, you know, you look at commercial architects, you look at commercial designers, you look at people who are practicing in our built environment. We wanted to just do a survey across the board and see what architects are doing what type of work, right? So what we ended up doing was creating this big matrix and understanding that there are commercial practices, there are research-related practices, there are pedagogical-related practices, there are architects that just do a lot of activism as well. There are people who are trained in spatial strategy who are working, for example, for the development plan for the UDRI or whatever. So we did this kind of big cross-section, and then we made a film, right? And we've been just showing this to architects and urbanists. And we've been showing it actually internationally. We just came back from Shanghai, and tonight is a screening in Paris with one of the universities there. And it was just kind of, and a lot of schools are showing this film because, you know, we're trying to actually say that, you know, if you want to become an architect or you want to become an urban designer, you don't have to just be that. You don't have to say that I'm going to get out, I'm just going to practice, I'm going to make a building, I'm going to make a space. You could be doing research on what the next new housing typologies are. You could be an activist, like somebody in the film is an activist that vies for public spaces. You know, they just keep on filing PILs, they keep on going to court. They're an architect, they have projects, but they're always out there in the public realm, putting things together to save public spaces. Another group has started its own school. Another 2 architects have started their own school because they wanted to teach architects differently. They don't want to teach them in the same way, all right? So there are many different things people are doing. I think what one doesn't look at it as an individual action, but it looks at it as a kind of a collective action. And if you start to change the mindset at a very, you know, kind of low level where you're learning the education and you're being educated, then that's really what forms you later on, you know, and it's something that Pratik said earlier. We don't lose our origins. So, and those origins are very important because the older we get, the harder it is to change, right? So many things that we can do to do that as designers or as architects.
Very good evening. My name is Ratan Deep. My question is to Mark. Mark, thanks for reminding us that the Dutch landscape is flat, as well as you mentioned windmills also. What I do wish to say is that the Dutch coastline is characterized by dikes, which is something that's absolutely unique in the world. It's, I would say, a certain personal admiration for the Dutch people of having innovated this to, actually overcome the influence of the elements, which is a force of the sea, to survive, to irrigate, to cultivate. Do let me know, please, share with us, has this influenced your sense of design, your sense of work, anything that comes into part of your work in terms of design, urbanization, as well as internalization?
Yeah, you make me almost shy, because it is indeed something to be very proud of. For those of you who, Holland has about 16 million people at the moment. I think 1/3 of the country is below sea level. So about 5-6 million people live below sea level. So all our major cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Den Haag, are all below sea level. And not just a little bit, I think till about this floor. There used to be a sign at Schiphol, when you landed, about 3 meters high, that said this is sea level, but they took it away because some people left the country straight away, so that wasn't so good. But it's true, and I think it explains anything is possible. If you are, anything is possible at any moment, as long as you fight with the elements. And fight isn't maybe the right word, work with the elements. Use the elements that you've got, because there's also many possibilities. We learned to create dikes, we learned to create how to actually use the water for export. Rotterdam was the biggest harbor in the world. So we're actually using all of these ship lanes, and actually it brought Holland what it is today. But maybe the Consul wants to add something to that?
Thank you very much, and it's a very interesting question. I think what it comes down to really is that we needed to kind of wrestle our territory from the sea. We don't have much land. We have to wrestle it from the sea. It's a perennial struggle, if you will. And that also means that we have to be really efficient with our land. And the funny thing is, if you would be flying over the Netherlands when you arrive in the Netherlands, what you would see is actually this design. This is a Dutch artist called Mondriaan, maybe you know him. And what you will be seeing from the sky is a tableau of Mondriaan, but not in blue, white, or yellow, or red, but in green. So I think that this efficiency of how to use scarce resources, how to use scarce territory, is really something that, to my mind, would exemplify Dutch design.
Yeah, also the knowledge at one point, if you travel, there is land that has no particular purpose. That was something I didn't know existed till about the age of 16. Every piece of land that you have had a purpose, because it's always being used. Like we always use the shapes. And that's of course what design is use the white and the white space in between text, in between everything else, actually creates the design. Design is about leaving things out instead of adding things, and that's exactly what Mondriaan did. There's actually he all started with a tree at one point and kind of abstracted all the way till he had this pattern.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up, and I want to thank everyone again, the panelists and the audience as well, for sitting here for tonight for this discussion, and of course Masque, the Consul General, Avid, and El Decor for helping put this together. And I think it's a really big question, and I think it's not one that we're going to answer, but it's good to think about. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists and to Rajiv, of course, for a very compelling discussion. Thank you to Masque, El Decor, the Consulate of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and all your respective teams for partnering with us to bring you this event. Thank you, audience, for being here and engaged as always. Visit us online to know more about what's coming up at Avid Learning and #Learning Never Stops. The party continues outside for ID Satellite Mumbai Design Trails at Shakti Mills. So do join us there, and thank you.